Greetings and salutations, dear viewer, and welcome to another episode of the Politics of Discretion podcast. If my voice sounds a little funny, please forgive me, as the pollen is out in force here in southwestern Pennsylvania, and my allergies are running a little rampant. But that aside, I want to talk about a vein of rhetoric that has particular sway at the moment. And this is not an exclusive phenomenon. It's occurred at various points in history before, and it always has the same effect, which is to erode the high barrier that is supposed to exist between government and the private sector. And the erosion of this barrier is concerning because it always has the effect of infringing upon individual rights and of really undermining the entire ideology of individual sovereignty, which is supposed to underlie this country. And I am talking, of course, about nationalism and the other rhetorical tool that often goes hand in hand with it, which is protectionism. And this is applied both domestically and in terms of international policy, most frequently in the guise of trade protectionism. Now, specifically with this administration, I think the biggest way that we see this promoted is through repetition of the phrase America first, and this idea that America needs to come first. And this has some legitimate political grounding, and the idea that as far as government is concerned, there is a genuine interest in a politics that promotes stability and promotes the long-term existence of a regime, and that through this you can have rule of law. If you have constant upheaval, constant overturning of regimes, of infighting, bickering, and you're not passing rule of law, then ultimately you're not benefiting the citizenry. Ultimately, you can't really have freedom. So there is a valid interest in having a stable, overarching frame of government. Now, this is supposed to come not through law specifically, but through the framework from which we derive law and determine what makes a rule just or unjust. And of course, this is the Constitution in America, which again ultimately defaults to the idea that the people are the sole legitimate font of political power, and that all law needs to ultimately respect individual sovereignty, which cannot be taken away even by a law that seems just. In fact, any law that infringes upon individual sovereignty is actually unjust, no matter how solid the argument might be for the fact that it benefits some portion of the population. And America First has really made a resurgence of late, specifically in regards to the issue of trade. And I know I've talked this to death, but this is really important because it does erode individual sovereignty, and that is really the most fundamental thing of importance in politics if you want to have a free society, is the idea that government is limited and the idea that it does actually respect the rights of individuals, not just as some sort of deferential check, but in actuality that is the actual heft behind legal rationales and politicians when they look to craft laws. And America First is, again, not exclusive to Donald Trump. It's been used in various times before. The New Deal in particular is another era where the idea that domestic stability had to come before all else, and this gave government power to act in ways that it hadn't necessarily acted before, that this was an excuse for government intrusion. This was seen during the New Deal, and it's starting to exist in the same way now, which should be alarming. But getting back to the concept of America First, it is primarily being used by the president as a reason to promote domestic trade and to implement policies that insulate the United States and producers in the United States from competition. Additionally, the idea is that it should promote America globally, that American goods somehow have more of a right than the goods of other nations to be received by our trading partners and should receive a sort of preeminent status. This, even though it's painted in the light that ultimately this boosts consumers and producers, is really not the case. Because, for one, protectionism drives up the cost of materials, it increases the cost of goods, and this is passed on to the consumer. And effectively, this means that your dollar doesn't go as far, which really means that it's less efficient. And really, when it comes to free trade, you want an economic system that's efficient, meaning that you, as a consumer, with a certain set of values which you are looking to fulfill in a given economic transaction, are able to go out and find the best value for value exchange with a producer who either has a good that you really want or who promotes a worldview that you agree with, and so you want to further their business and boost them in the world. And the ability to do this for the least monetary cost possible, remember there are other kinds of value, and we've talked about that before, is really a gauge of efficiency. And the more efficient that transaction is, the more transactions of that type you can make, the further your dollar goes, which means effectively that you as an individual are able to promote your own set of value judgments to a greater extent because you're able to utilize that dollar efficiently. Now, the problem with America First and with protectionism and trade nationalism in general goes beyond the rising price of goods and government intervention in markets and the barriers it erects between consumers and producers. It also promotes this idea that American goods are superior simply by the fact that they are produced in America, and that this is enough to make the rest of the world trade with us, or at least it should be. That somehow other nations of the world are supposed to recognize value in terms of the country of origin of a good, and that American consumers domestically are supposed to too, and that they should prize American produced goods over imported goods. Now, this, of course, is not how value actually works. As I've just discussed, value is in part imputed by the interaction of a particular consumer who comes to the economic forum with their own set of value judgments and who looks for certain goods and for certain services that contain some sense of that value, whether that's in the actual product itself or whether it's in the business model of a given company, and they then seek out those goods that resonate with their own sense of what is right and wrong. So value is in some way extrinsic to goods, but it's also intrinsic to goods as well. And this comes through certain principles of production, whether or not a good is produced well or whether it's produced cheaply. It goes to the level of expertise and craftsmanship involved. It goes to the quality of materials, and ultimately it goes to the vision of the producer and the passion that they bring to the table, the ingenuity that they bring to the table. And so value here again takes on two sense. It is endemic to those principles of production, which ultimately result in the quality of the good itself. And then in a more abstract sense, it exists extrinsically, meaning that it exists apart from whatever the good that's being traded is. It's in the ability of consumers to not only find a good that they think fits some need, that they think has been produced well and is offered at a good cost, but in the ability to support companies and products that they believe bring something of value into the world and promote it that way. And the ability to support companies that they like, whether that is a giant multinational corporation that has policies which give back to its employees, that does things for the communities that patronize it, and for the communities where its plants are housed, or whether it's because the farmer down the road is a friend of yours and you like their attitude and you want to support him. So value in neither of these ways that it exists is endemic to the geographic origin of a good. And that's the problem with America First rhetoric as it applies to trade. By instilling virtue in the origin of the good, by attributing it to the geographic region from which it comes, it takes credit away from the producer. And that's a problem because it mitigates the fact that it was individual genius that first conceived of a good, that figured out how to produce it, that created a business, that marketed it. That all of this is ultimately catalyzed by the productive capacity of the mind and the individual's ability to think creatively and to act productively. And that's really what needs to be glorified through trade, is the creative genius of the entrepreneur and the force of their productive power. That's the real engine of the economy, and that is an individual thing. That doesn't come from nation states, that doesn't come through geopolitical trade, that doesn't come from anything except the locus of the individual and whatever vision they have and their ability to apply their talent towards an end. So the emphasis here really needs to be on the individual. And trade nationalism takes that away. And it doing so, it reduces the sense of the individual as agent in their own lives and as agent in the process of production. Instead, it promotes the idea that, well, it's the country that matters. And if that's true, then it's the country's policies that matter and not the company or the person who produced the good. It's the ability of nation states um, to craft policies that create certain conditions that give people the freedom to go out and produce. The emphasis there is on the nation state and not on the individual. Is a sense that that freedom is then contingent on the beneficence of the state and its desire to create that space where individuals are free to produce. And that ultimately comes with the idea that that individual then owes the state something, that because the state has promoted these policies that give the individual that freedom, that the state is then owed something of the profits that are made, because it's the idea that, well, you didn't build that on your own, you built that because of infrastructure, you built that because we stood back and didn't regulate you and let you do your thing. Now in return for utilizing all of those state-produced policies, you need to give back to the state. And that really takes that sense of ownership and agency away from the individual producer. And we can see this in the weird way that trade is discussed under the guise of protectionism. It's as if it's capital T trade, this one monolithic entity that that has this really permanent existence and can be, if you change policy X, then trade just follows suit. And that's not how markets work, and that's not how free trade works. Markets are the expression of a group of individuals within a certain confines and of the autonomous choices that they make. And again, those autonomous choices are driven by value judgments and the ability to find producers and products whose value judgment resonates with those of consumers, because that's that standard for value. Trade is a value for value exchange. You make a trade with someone when you think that you're getting something in return that is at least as valuable as that which you give up, or ideally is more valuable than that which you give up. Again, this is this idea of efficiency. And because that ultimately is also rooted in the rational capacity of the individual mind, right? So it goes both ways. Both producers and consumers are rational autonomous agents. Trade is something that's constantly in flux. Markets are something that are constantly in flux. It's not some monolithic thing that if you change policy X means that trade simply follows suit in whatever way. It can't be molded like that because it is the product of autonomy and of individual processes and individual decisions. And again, because people are individuals, that means that there are multiple ideologies competing with each other, which again is a positive because it ultimately is respectful of individual sovereignty. And that emphasis is really lost when we adopt the mantle of nationalism. And the rhetoric that has come out of the administration as of late really highlights it, because there's this loss of respect for the suffering of particular individuals in industries that have been hit hard. Right, we had this Section 232 tariffs announced by the Trump administration that targeted imported steel and aluminum. In response, China announced a round of retaliatory tariffs, which specifically targeted certain agricultural products. Soybeans was one of the most talked about, and they were specifically targeted to hit agricultural centers. And there was a correlation, which many news agencies noted, between the areas that would be hardest hit by these targets and the communities that supported Donald Trump. And this is significant because Donald Trump ran on the idea of nationalism and the idea that he was going to protect the forgotten workers of middle class America, the kind of, average Joe who Washington elites and coastal elites tend to dismiss when they craft policy. And he said that he was going to be their champion. And yet now that we have these tariffs and this escalating situation as a result of his unilateral policies of protectionism and trade nationalism, suddenly the people who are being hit by these tariffs, who are supposedly the people whom he feels a kinship to and whom his administration is desirous of protecting and promoting, suddenly they don't matter as much. Suddenly you've got the president, who last week was running around and saying that, oh, well, the farmers, they're great patriots, and they know that in the long run that this is in their best interest, as if suddenly, the fact that someday they might be benefited, that means that in the short term it's okay to promote policies that that impose hardship and economic woe on certain sectors of the population, and they're supposed to just grin and bear it because the state has told them, well, don't worry, because we know it's in your best interest, and in the long run we'll get there. And clearly this is devoid of the respect for the productive capacity of the individual. It's this dismissive attitude, and it's not just the president who is acting like this. It's been Peter Navarro, it's been Sonny Perdue, it's been even Larry Kudlow to some extent, and the talking down of the escalation of a potential trade war, in the idea that, well, don't worry, we're the administration, we know what's in your best interest, and don't get excited, just sit back and trust us, and yeah, maybe in the short term you're going to face some economic hardship, but in the long run it's for the cause of the country, and because you're an American, that means that you'll benefit by it. Well, the question is, what gives the administration the right to make that essentially that value judgment about cost benefit analyses? And the answer in trade nationalism is, well, the administration does have that ability because it's America first, and because there's this sense that the conditions of the economy are based not on the efforts of individual producers and consumers, but ultimately on the policies that create that environment for trade. And so because it's the state that controls those, what the state giveth, the state can taketh away. So that freedom that you once enjoyed, well, we've decided that's no longer in the best interest of the country in the long term, so we're going to change that. But again, because we've got that long-term consideration, don't complain about short-term economic woes, think about the long term. And that takes away the ability of the producer to make those cost benefit analyses for themselves. And of course, the ability to produce something, the ability to have a free economy is based solely on that cost benefit analysis, which is undertaken by the rational mind of the producer and the consumer, and particularly in the mind of the producer, because it's the producer who undertakes a great deal of initial risk when he begins a business. Because just because you have some idea, and it might be the most brilliant idea in the world, doesn't necessarily mean that you have the ability to produce that on a scale that would make that product economically viable. That involves other people who are going to aid you in that process, and you have a right to yourself, but you don't have a right to the productive capacities of others. So if no one wants to help you, if they don't find a good value for value exchange in helping you and in assuming part of that risk, then your product is never going to get off the ground. And the same thing is true of marketing. Again, even if you do have a brilliant idea, even if you are able to market it and produce it, that doesn't mean that people are going to buy it, because there are those separate autonomous beings with a rational capacity to make value for value judgments. So it really is ultimately about the risk assessment done by the individual, and the ultimately the producer has to decide, well, I have this vision and I believe in it, and I believe in my own productive capacities. I believe in my own greatness. I believe in my own rationality, and I believe that I can overcome all obstacles, and that's what it takes for a good to be produced, and to then become influential in one's own life and in society more broadly, is ultimately about that cost benefit analysis, and that not only the productive and creative genius of the individual mind, but the rationality of the mind, right? This is not to denigrate individuals in any way, because as I've spent the last 20 minutes talking about, trade ought to glorify the productive capacity of the individual. But there's that recognition that there are great barriers to be overcome in creating a successful product and creating a successful business, and that ultimately it's the individual who has to sort of noodle through all of those problems and to determine what choices he has to make in order to bring his vision into being. And that's a difficult thing to do, which should be all the more reason to glorify those who take that risk and who are successful in doing it. But the point here is that ultimately that decision is up to the individual. They retain full autonomy over their lives and their choices, and they get to decide whether certain risks, whether certain choices that are going to lead to short-term woe are worth the long-term benefit. But trade nationalism takes this away. And the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, and the idea that, well, yes, you're going to sacrifice in the short term, and we're going to force you to sacrifice. That's the biggest problem with it, is there's this idea that, oh, well, the farmers are doing it because they too believe in America first. But of course, the farmers didn't have any say in it. It's been imposed on them by the judgment of really solely of the president through his unilateral executive actions. And that is yet another way in which individual autonomy is eroded. And that ultimately is the takeaway of the rhetoric of America First and of the policies of trade nationalism, is the fact that it does really truncate the sphere in which individuals are seen as being autonomous and sovereign actors. The idea of America First, where the emphasis is on the geography of a good and on the nation state and on the policies of a nation state which make production possible, promotes the idea that government has some ownership not only over the individual's actions but also of the goods produced, because again government thinks it's created the conditions that has given the individuals the freedom to act as they have and to become successful. But the truth of the matter is that government does not own goods, even if through America First policy it thinks it does, because production is an individual act. It is an act of the individual's mind, the individual mind ability to conceive and to take that abstract conception and turn it into a tangible good. It's not the nation that benefits from trade, at least not immediately. It's the individuals who are driving trade who benefit from it. And just as producers are the only ones who can determine whether short-term loss is worth long-term gain, or at least the anticipation of long-term gain, individuals are the only ones who can be seen as having ownership of goods and of the means of production. And the sense of value that is connected to productive capacity and the ingenuity of individuals has to remain the nucleus of trade, has to remain the nucleus of policy. Anytime we talk about this, we need to pay deference to the fact that it is the individual mind and its rational capacity and its ability to think abstractly and to conceive of things that don't yet exist, right? That's something really incredible to think about. This trade is not just linear thinking. Production is not just linear thinking. Somewhere, someone has to conceive of something that does not yet exist and figure out how to bring it into being. And that's where creativity comes into trade and into business. And that's a really powerful thing. And we need to pay deference of that, and we need to respect that, because when we don't, not only does it denigrate the individual, but it also severely hampers the possibility that the kind of growth, the kind of ingenuity that we've seen that has really spurred such evolution in technology within the past decades, that's going to cease, because the state is not creative, the state is not a producer. It can't think, it can't act, and when it does, as in the case of trade nationalism, it takes away the ability of individuals to do so. It gains a sense of individual autonomy, which is improper in government organs, because they are supposed to simply enforce rule of law and to make law based on the question, does this respect individual rights or not? That is the only thing that the state has the power to do. When it becomes more cognizant, when it starts to sympathize with certain groups of people and to promote policies that it claims are in their interest, it actually hurts them, as we can see with the case of America First. And the idea that producers might be benefited by promoting America on the world stage and by restricting the flow of international goods into the country because they somehow create negative competition that affects producers, well, they're more hurt by the fact that the state has now taken away the locus of production as a product of the individual mind, of the individual capacity, and has instead promoted itself and its beneficence and interjected itself into the space where previously people were free to act, and now it's limited that space. And that's true of consumers too, is when protectionism occurs, they lose the ability to make those value judgments which ought to drive trade, because it restricts the flow of goods, and free flow of goods that, I mean, there is some possibility in a truly free market, that yeah, American consumers might be hurt in the sense that trade protectionist mean when they talk about it, as in their production numbers might go down, they might produce less, because people are finding goods from external markets that they find of more value. But that ultimately, even though it might hurt the producer, who again doesn't have the right to prosper, specifically when other people's money is involved, but it does also hurt the consumer by restricting the choices available to them and by limiting their ability to make those value judgments and to seek out goods that they ultimately find something of resonance in, something that they want to promote in the world. And this is why the individual needs to be at the heart of trade, and why trade protectionism and why America First rhetoric is um, ultimately dangerous to individual sovereignty, because it places the emphasis on the state as protector and places the emphasis of trade in national policies and not in freedom, but also is dangerous to the idea of individual autonomy, because it inherently takes the power of value judgment away from the individual and gives it over to the state and breathes life into the state in a way that is only going to further erode individual autonomy. So really, even though trade protectionism claims to help a certain set of people in the polity, even though it claims to desire to promote the economic welfare of a certain group, in the long run, it ultimately undermines their rights and ultimately uh, does damage to their well-being.